Okay, well, thank you so much for that introduction. Let me go ahead and share my screen with y'all. Okay, everyone see my screen all right?
Yes.
All right, perfect. All right, well, as Penny said, my name is Dr. Kelsey Bryant. I am a relatively new postdoctoral research here at the University of Idaho in the Department of Forest, Rangeland, and Fire Sciences. And so today I'm going to be talking about forests and carbon, as she said, but I want to talk a little bit about what I do specifically. I am a tree climber and a tree physiologist, and how these two fit together is really important for me. A lot of the research that we do and a lot of the models that predict our overall forest levels come from information that were done on small trees or seedlings in laboratory experiments, because this is what's feasible for a lot of this research. And I'm not knocking that. That's really important to do that kind of research. But when we scale it up to the forest, we really need to know how mature trees are responding. So this is how I got to be a tree climbing physiologist. Is I was like, how do I get up there and find out what they're doing and really find out what these trees in the forest are doing? Not a tree in a lab, not a young tree, but a mature tree that is responsible for sequestering all of the carbon that we really depend on it to do. So that's a little bit about me and how I'm going to use this research here at Idaho is to inform carbon models and really inform models that predict how forests are going to respond to some of these climate changes that we're seeing. Not just the intensity of wildfires, but the prolonged droughts and the increases in temperatures as well. So I work in Tara Hudeberg's lab. She calls her lab I-Team. Even though there is no I in team, we are very much a team, and none of this research, anything I present today, all of it would not be possible without a big group of people. So I've listed just some of the people on the side here. It is Tara Hudeberg's lab, and then several of these people are PhD students, master's students, postdocs, current and previous, that have really helped this research along. And so our motto is seeing the forest for the carbon, and hopefully I can kind of explain to you how we do that today and why this is so important. All right, so as we talked about, like our lab logo says, we're really interested in understanding carbon dynamics of forests and using these in-field, field-based measurements to inform these predictive models and really understand what we're doing as humans to modify these landscapes. So today I'm going to talk to you about specifically research from two of the different NSF funded that Tara has going on, one here in Moscow, Idaho, and Moscow Mountain, and then one down in Central Oregon that's pretty interesting as well. So why forests? And forests store half of the terrestrial carbon on Earth. So everything that grows, everything that we use to breathe, forests are responsible for in some way. And to put that in another perspective, trees store more carbon than any other life form on Earth. So I know we like to think we're very important as humans, but when we remove ourselves from the equation, I really think trees are the most important organisms on Earth, and essentially for this reason, because they store all of the carbon that essentially turns into everything that we need, including our oxygen. So to kind of talk about how carbon moves through a forest and how that changes when a wildfire comes through or when we thin or manage our forest, I really want to start talking at the tree level, because I really study things on an individual level, and then we do scale that up to a forest level and ecosystem level. But at the individual tree level, carbon is coming in through a process called photosynthesis. It's kind of replicated here at the top, and that's in green because that's positive carbon. So as you may know, CO2 is in the atmosphere. It comes into the plant through little pores called stomata on the leaves. There's tons of these. It then goes into the plant and is responsible for all of the growth, all of the metabolism, all of the sugars. And so when you think about positive carbon inputs in a tree or in a forest, you're talking about carbon uptake through photosynthesis and growth. When you talk about carbon losses, we're really talking about soil respiration. And respiration just means breathing. Literally, the CO2 comes out of the soil the same way we breathe out CO2, just in different quantities. And so these are losses. And this is happening because there's lots and lots of activity going on below ground that we can't see, that is also good in storing and sequestering and using carbon and acquiring nutrients for plants, but it does result in some kind of carbon being respired from the soil as well. And then there's also a carbon loss through animal and plant respiration, just through breathing. So there's this constant input and then this constant output. And when we're measuring carbon, our net carbon balance is that input minus those outputs. And so this is happening at the tree level, but then this is happening for every single tree, every single plant, and then we're scaling that up to the forest level. So what happens when a fire comes in? When a fire comes in, it's obviously going to decrease some of the leaf area on the tree, which can decrease the overall photosynthesis coming in and the overall net carbon uptake, but also decreases soil respiration and the amount of CO2 being lost. So it's kind of a decrease in both places and a net ecosystem carbon reduction in the short term. However, we're still trying to understand how that changes in the long term and what factors influence the change and whether that carbon balance becomes positive or negative. So to answer this, we're going to talk about specifically what happens to forests after wildfire. So the idea when I talk about wildfire, what I really mean is no pre-management strategy. Many of the fires that we've heard about over the summer that have come through and just ravaged landscapes where a lot is decimated because there is such a buildup of that understory. There wasn't anything thinned, nothing removed. And so when that understory burned, these wildfires just spread uncontrollably. And so what happens to the trees in response to this kind of fire? To answer this question, I'm going to first delve into the results from our Oregon project. And so this is actually a picture from one of our drone flights that shows the effects of this fire that came through in August of 2020 down in Central Oregon. It's around Sisters, Oregon, if you're familiar with the area. And we had a previous site set up there where we were already measuring climate, different things. And so when this fire came through, it really allowed us to study the effects of forest to fire in a place where we already had data and kind of already understood the ecosystem. So with us?
We're good. Yeah, we're good.
Okay, perfect. All right. So why am I talking about Oregon? I want to relate this back to Idaho just a little bit. So here is a map on the left of the two sites that I'll be talking about today. Overall, this is a map of just kind of already set up long-term field sites. So anywhere you see a star is somewhere where we have a lot of data for some different organization or in some different way about these forests. So up here, we are the University of Idaho Experimental Forest. That's what the blue means. And this is sites that are set up on Moscow Mountain. If you're familiar with the area, we have a few of them set up, and I'll talk about those later in the presentation. But our other main site is down here in Central Oregon. This is this orange one, and this was the Ameriflux site. I mentioned we had previous data that relates to that. And so these two sites are very similar in terms of their climate. If we look over here on the right in the top panel, you can see they have a very similar temperature, and this is just the climate normals or the typical climate variables through time. And they have pretty similar precipitation. Idaho does receive more precipitation throughout the year, and that's specifically important during the summer. So we are going to kind of understand, compare these two sites to understand the precipitation response. But overall, these two sites are really similar, and it allows us to look at how forests in two very different places with similar climates are responding to better expand our results to a wider geographic range. Okay. So this is why I'm talking about Oregon. And for the first part of the presentation, I'll be talking about these results from Oregon where we had the wildfire come through. And so this was a project that specifically looked at the response to that mixed severity wildfire. And then later, I'll talk a little bit about some of our results from the project in Moscow Mountain. And that is a controlled burn site where we have thinned and not thinned in some places over the last 5 years, allowing us to compare how that changes things. Okay, so this was This is another picture, drone shot from the site in Sisters, Oregon. Again, it just kind of shows the very mixed impacts of this. And, you know, within very close distances, you have trees that were completely charred and damaged to trees that were completely scorched, but their needles weren't consumed. It's kind of all this brown through here, and then trees that are still completely green right next to it. So a very mixed fire, but did have severe impacts. And just to kind of show you what this looks like and to have a bit of fun, I'm going to show you a drone shot on this next clip. So one of the things we're doing is trying to quantify the effects of the fire using remote imaging, and we can use the drone to do that. Really quite beautiful, but you can really see the effects. That's the tower that collects all the climate data. You can really see how different the effects were in really close proximity. And this is in the Deschutes National Forest, if you're familiar with that area. Okay, so as you saw, this wildfire left a range of effects on really close trees, allowing us to study how trees respond in terms of individual carbon uptake and overall just health and survival in response to fire. Because something that we don't really know as a field is at what point is a tree completely dead? All those trees that we saw where all the needles were scorched, but there's still needles on the tree, will that tree bounce back? Essentially is what we're asking. Will that tree resume growth and put on new needles, allowing it to continue carbon uptake? Because if so, in the long run, that's really important, and that's going to improve our carbon balance in a positive direction if that tree is able to persist. So we want to know at what level of fire damage are those trees able to continue physiological activity. So to understand this, we can employ a range of measurements. This is just an example of a MET station or meteorological station. This is where you collect typical data that you look up on your weather apps. So precipitation, temperature, something we refer to as vapor pressure deficit, which is just basically how dry it is in terms of the plant, and all kinds of variables. So this is just a climate collection station, so to speak. So to reach the tops of the trees, we have to get up there, right? And there's a couple ways of doing this. On the left, you see one of my colleagues, Crystal. She's using a 12-gauge shotgun, and we're always allowed to do this, of course. It does not damage the tree in any way. If you're a good shot, you can shoot down the needles. This has been done for years in the field. And then as soon as you get the needles down, you can take measurements within a given time frame. Alternatively, I'm a certified tree climber. I prefer to climb the trees if I'm able to do so, always in a safe manner with ropes and whatnot. And so these are the two ways that we access leaves at the top of the canopy. So we really know what's going on a canopy level and not just at a ground level. So just to show you a little bit of the measurements and methodology that we use, these are a few pictures from the field. This is just a typical branch sample on the left. You immediately submerge it in water so that the needles are rehydrated. In the middle, these are sap flux probes. Basically, this just measures water movement through the trees. If you want to know more about that, I can speak to you at length about that. Feel free to email me or ask questions. But we basically install these little tiny probes and connect them to a deep cycle marine battery like you would put in your boat or an RV. And we power the trees or power the sensors, which allows us to see the rate at which the water is moving. We can measure soil respiration, or that variable that I was talking about, how we measure CO2 being lost through this apparatus. We just set it down. It tells us how much CO2 is coming out. This is a picture of Tara climbing. She also climbs trees pretty regularly, and we access the canopy in multiple different ways to get these measurements. And then we can measure changes in tree growth on a daily basis and a seasonal basis, because trees actually fluctuate pretty regularly. And you can calculate that change in growth through something called dendrometer bands. Again, you can ask me about any of this methodology if you're curious. And then the last tool that's just really important is something called It's actually called an infrared gas analyzer, but for simplicity, we call it a photosynthesis machine. And it just allows us to clip onto a needle and measure in real time how much carbon is being taken up at that leaf level. And then we can scale that up to the canopy level and then the forest level and so forth. So this is some of the methodology we use to collect all the stuff that I'm about to show you. And so in this Oregon project, this was really, really fascinating. What you're looking at here is on the y-axis is just think of it as daily water use. And that's what I was talking about with the sat flux and those probes we stick in there. We're essentially just measuring when water is moving. Water moves upwards in a tree against gravity. And so you can just in one direction and you can measure a change in temperature to tell when that water is moving. And so we were able to do this after the fire to see how differently damaged trees were moving water if they were still doing so, because if they're moving water, then they're opening their stomata, they're taking in carbon, they're resuming physiological activity, and they're not completely shut down. And so each one of these panels essentially represents a tree, and a single tree over time. This is about from February, the end of February, beginning of March through August of this year in 2021. And the trees go in order from least damaged to most damaged. So really green is not that damaged, like a tree that looks like this over here on the left. Whereas over here on the right, super brown, reddish color would be a lot of damage. So this tree right here on the right, and those were the trees you were seeing in the aerial view that were basically completely white or red looking. And so we refer to this, how damaged they are, as their burn severity. And basically just this really red would be a 1, very, very damaged, and completely green. This is actually like a 0.5. So not damaged as much. And so essentially what we saw is that all of the trees were moving water to some degree. And so the trees that were very damaged, these 3 on the bottom, where you can clearly see they're moving less water than some of the less damaged trees. It's not a perfect metric. Some of the medium damaged trees, so to speak, also were moving very low amounts of water, indicating substantial damage. But overall, 7 out of the 12 trees, the majority of them were moving substantial amounts of water. And actually these 3 in the middle they're pretty heavily damaged. So 0.71, so like a 0.86 would be red needles almost to the top of the tree, barely any green. And they're still moving tons and tons of water a day, lots and lots of water a day, regular, comparable to unburned trees, what you would expect from an unburned tree. So these are typical rates that we would see seasonally, kind of an increase. And so this is good news. It shows that even really damaged trees are still functioning on some hydraulic level. And this leads us to believe that, okay, maybe even a tree that looks completely consumed by fire, if it still has needles, it can bounce back and continue taking up carbon. Another way of looking at this is something called photosynthetic rate. So again, just how much carbon is coming in. And that was the little picture of the little machine, the photosynthesis machine on the needle. And basically the orange boxes are burned trees and the white boxes are unburned trees. And by unburned, I mean, wasn't even exposed to fire, no burn at all. And they basically have comparable photosynthetic rates. So there is some reduction overall, but even by this following year, the fire was in August of 2020. And a year later, less than a year later, burned trees have photosynthetic rates similar to unburned trees, are continuing to take in carbon at a higher rate than we would expect for a tree that had all red needles. I'm going to briefly go about this. If you want to talk more about this, I can go into this in greater specificity, but for simplicity's sake, we're just going to call this photosynthetic capacity. So what you're seeing on this graph is that the photosynthetic capacity, or the ability of a tree to photosynthesize, is increasing with burn severity. And this is really, really interesting because it means that the most severely burned trees, the green needles on the most severely burned trees have a higher capacity to photosynthesize than green needles on a less burned tree. And so if you think of that, if the tree has burned all the way up and only has a few green needles at the top, what's happening is those green needles are the tree sending all of its resources there, and those green needles are really compensating in some level for the lack of other needles by increasing their capacity to photosynthesize and take in carbon, which would then allow growth for other needles. So this is the first time this has been shown in the field, and this is a really interesting find, and we're hoping to eliminate more on this in this next year. We also found that root density, so just the amount of roots, decreased with burn severity, as we would expect. So the higher, the more red a tree was, or the more damaged a tree was, the lesser roots that it had. So this could account for some of that really low water movement and some of those really, really burned trees. We also found that there was lower soil carbon dioxide respiration. So again, I talked about at the beginning, when there's a fire, we would expect that the CO2 coming out of the soil would decrease. This could be due to the reduction in roots, just a reduction when the forest floor is burned. There's a lot of stuff below ground that that can be hurt from that too, also be consumed that we may not see, and that loss of below ground function can change the rates of CO2 coming out. So overall, we saw a reduction in the amount of CO2 being respired from the ground, indicating maybe a loss of below ground function. But by 2021, this year, less than a year later, those rates had completely resumed. They're not similar to what they would be pre-fire, but they're getting closer throughout the year. And they were lowest in the most severely burned soil in this red bar here. And this just means that the really high areas, the really highly burned areas, those most burnt areas, had the least amount of soil respiration, the least amount of below ground functioning, so to speak, which kind of goes hand in hand with our lower root densities from these more severely burned trees. So overall, we expect this reduction in overall carbon dioxide. And when we think, this also shows that even a year later, there's a return to normal. And by 2 years, we expect that things would be completely functioning as they were before the fire. So all in all, this is really, really interesting for us because it shows that only 1 year after the fire, there was new growth present on most of these trees. And so this is a shot, the one over here on the right, from the tops of one of those trees that looked completely consumed in the drone flight that I showed you. And that drone flight was taken in October of 2020. So just 2 months after the fire. And then this is 1 year. This was taken in August of this year. So 1 year after the fire. And you see substantial new growth. And then over here on the left, you can see that isn't just a little new growth. It's pretty substantial. So we can't always see from the ground maybe how much a tree is recovering. And to give you some idea, and we're standing on the ground, we couldn't see this. Like we couldn't see how green that was because you're looking up into the sun. And so it looks really red. And that's why these drone shots are really important to quantify this. Because when we look back at these shots, we see these trees that appear to be completely red, completely damaged, a tree that a logger might come through and say, oh, that tree is going to die anyway, let's just cut it down. No, this tree is actually physiologically active. It's taking up carbon, it's resuming growth. It's fine. And we expect that the following year, it'll be even more fine. And so this is really important. This has huge implications for kind of how we respond to wildfires. We're going to talk in a minute about, what we can do to prevent them and how we can manage things beforehand, but how we respond after a fire is equally important because that is going to determine the trajectory of that carbon recovery and whether it comes back or not. And so what I'm talking about when I talk about this carbon recovery or net carbon, this is just kind of a hypothetical figure here. And if you think of the y-axis as net carbon, so anything above zero is positive. It means that the forest is a carbon sink, which is what we want. We want the forest to be a carbon sink. We want it to be taking in carbon, more carbon than it's producing, right? If it's letting out, respiring more carbon than it's taking in, then that forest is a carbon source. And that's not good, right? We already have enough carbon sources. I have fossil fuels burning. We're driving around all day. We have greenhouse gases. We have a lot of carbon sources. So we really need these forests to be carbon sinks. We need them to be increasing their net carbon balance, not decreasing it. But when you have a fire, what happens is you're kind of up here, we're positive in our carbon as a typical forest, and then something like a fire happens, and that drops. So all of a sudden, this forest, this area of land went from being a net carbon sink in the positive to a carbon source. Because fire removes a lot of that foliage, it at the same time for a fire release carbon dioxide emissions. It's also then causing reductions in CO2 respiration, it's causing reductions in CO2 uptake, and it's just causing an overall reduction in that carbon. However, as I've just showed you, even severely burned trees can recover. So the recovery potential here is extremely high. So I just really want to drill that in, that even when there's a severe fire, even if you have a piece of land and something comes through and it decimates it, and it seems catastrophic, in the long term, this can still be a positive thing and turn into a carbon positive balance if it's managed properly. And so this recovery potential, what determines that trajectory is really the post-fire management strategies. And I just want to point out, before I talk about the tree mortality does not equal instant carbon loss. So even in this situation, this is a situation where it's a severe fire. There's obviously no needles to take in any carbon or to help this tree die. But even if these trees are allowed to stand and fall naturally or even back into the ecosystem, that carbon is staying in the ecosystem. So there's a short-term loss in the carbon. Long-term, we're keeping the carbon in the ecosystem. So there's not some instant carbon loss just because this fire came through and took out the majority of active trees. This is a huge carbon loss. Massive tree removal does cause instant and continued carbon loss. So this is an example of what can happen when there's a fire, and I'm not faulting anybody, because when there's a fire and you have all these seemingly snags that are dead trees that are going to die, it seems like the right decision to save what you can. And there's a term I've learned since moving out west called salvage logging. And it's an interesting term to me because I personally don't think we're saving anything. We're not salvaging anything. Nothing was saved here. This is all carbon lost. This ecosystem is not going to recover. Below ground is as dead as above ground. There's nothing to recover here. So what do we save? Maybe we transported the carbon off in the form of logs, and it can benefit somebody in terms of a material, but in terms of net carbon balance, we didn't save anything. We made it worse. So all that's to say that what we do post-fire is really as important as how we manage pre-fire. And just because a tree appears dead or appears completely scorched by a fire doesn't mean it's not capable of bouncing back and then being a positive carbon input into this ecosystem. So just to harp on that just a little bit more, when we do log massive amounts of area or clear cut after a fire, or just get rid of all this wood, all this carbon that could be put back into the ecosystem in some way, we're essentially destroying that recovery potential. We took something that decreased that could have become positive again, and it's probably going to stay a net carbon source now rather than a sink. Over time, it's just going to change and it's going to grow back differently. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about what happens when there's a fire coming through, what happens to carbon when we manage after that fire. So if we leave the trees there, we're keeping the carbon in, giving the carbon a chance to become that ecosystem a chance to become a sink again and not a source. But what happens before fire? How can we manage in other ways? So one of the main questions a lot of people have is, how does thinning impact forest carbon? So a lot of the reasons we're having these high severity fires that come through and take out massive portions of land and spread all the way over mountain ranges is because we're not managing our forest in a way that is conducive to a fire culture. We want to be afraid of fire and we want to push it away, but that's not how fire works. Fire is a part of our culture. It has been long before we settled here, and we need to embrace that. And so whether you're thinning or you're harvesting in a selective manner and burning or not doing prescribed burns, thinning and working with your forest is a way to work with the fire and to prevent fire from taking over your forest, if that makes sense. So we need to have more of a working with it attitude to really keep the carbon in the forest and to really not have these catastrophic effects in the long term. And so in order to do that, we can essentially remove some of the density. So when a fire comes through, if it hasn't been managed in some way, there's all this undergrowth. So you can see in the back of this picture, it's really dense. That's what a dense forest looks like. There's what we call a high fuel load. So there's a lot of really carbon rich species. Just think of it as fuel. And when you thin, and this is kind of an extremely thin area, you're kind of removing that fuel load. So now if a fire were to come through, it's going to not have terrible effects or high severe effects that end up consuming the entire canopy. It's going to be very low effects, which, as we've seen, trees that are burned, even 75% of the way up, can still completely bounce back to a normal level, even within a year. So if the more we can do to keep those trees from complete consumption, the better that ecosystem has a chance of recovering. And so, as we talked about before, the net carbon positivity or negativity comes from when fire hits, there's a reduction in net ecosystem carbon, and then that can recover over time. Another thing that can reduce the carbon is harvesting. And so that can be clear cutting, that can be selective logging, thinning, however you want to term it. It's removing some portion of the forest before a wildfire comes through. So that's a benefit on both sides. So you can log some, you can gain money or income from logging from those products, but you're also benefiting the forest. And we're going to talk about how you do that. And when you harvest, how you harvest really determines the trajectory of this net carbon loss initially, and then the trajectory of the recovery potential in the long term. So we previously talked about how carbon moves through a forest on an individual tree level. It's coming in through all the stomata, it's moving through the tree, and then respiring back out. But remember that this is happening for every individual tree next to a bunch of other trees. So there's a lot of competition between these trees for resources, for water, and that can be even more of a competition during drought, which is severe in some areas during summer, for energy, for nutrients, for all kinds of things. When we thin, we're essentially removing not only the density, so it's less of a fire hazard, but what we're doing is we're allowing more water to get to these roots, more resources, more nutrients for these remaining trees, which in the long term is going to result in more carbon on a per tree level, which results in, on a small scale, net ecosystem carbon gain, right? So more growth equals more carbon, more water. It's going to be a healthier tree capable of survival, recovery in the long term. And then furthermore, when fire does come through in a thin stand, there's less likelihood of these trees being decimated in a way that the ecosystem can no longer recover. And so this is essentially what Tara and our group is testing up on Moscow Mountain. About 5 years ago now, she set up these thinned and unthinned treatments. So there's paired plots where some of the trees are really dense and they have the same equipment set up in both. Some of the plots are really dense and they haven't been managed. And then some are very thinned and have been burned and thinned between. And we're comparing the water use in these trees and then at ecosystem carbon gain on a tree level, and then scaling that to a forest level to really specifically understand how thinning can change that net carbon balance. And so today I'm just going to show you some of that preliminary data. Basically on the y-axis, we just have water use. So higher up here equals more water being moved in the tree. And then on the x-axis, we have time. And remember, again, when I talked about the sap flux sensors and those probes we were sticking in the tree, that's what this is here. If you walk around Moscow Mountain, if you happen to be in Idaho or at University of Idaho and in the area, you'll see these trees with this aluminum foil. This is just to reflect the sun because we are measuring temperature differentials and to deter animals. But this is what we're doing. We're just measuring water in the tree. And so this figure that I'm talking about on the right really comes from this data. And this was collected by a colleague earlier, Jeffrey Stencil, along with Tara. And what they were showing is that in these trees, in the thin stands, there is more water on a daily basis than in the control stands. And so we're still in the process of going through all this data and really putting it all together. It takes a very long time to get this data from temperature difference to something we can call water movement. But what we're seeing is what we'd expect, and it's really exciting that these thin trees the trees in the thinned areas are moving significantly more water than the trees in the unthinned areas. And we also have some preliminary data that suggests that they have more carbon growth using those dendrometer bands. We were able to see more daily carbon change and seasonally in the areas that were thinned. So it suggests that theory is correct and that trees in thinned areas benefit on a tree level, which increases the carbon acquisition for the whole forest. And so scaling this up again to the ecosystem level, if we look at our carbon balance again, we saw the same figure before, but it was either fire or harvest that was causing this net ecosystem carbon reduction. Remember that drought can also cause that. And right now, the combined effects of fire and drought are really critical to understand because we have seasonal drought anyway, but drought naturally decreases this carbon because when it's dry, the tree's response is to close its stomata, which prevents carbon uptake because it wants to preserve, because water comes out of the same pores that carbon comes in. So it naturally wants to close those pores, preserve the water, but that results in no more carbon coming in. And so this is a general response of trees to different degrees, and it reduces the amount of carbon acquired during drought. Harvest, when you thin, combined with drought, thinning, because as we just talked about, it increases the amount of water on a per tree basis, which also increases the amount of carbon potential on a per tree basis, kind of offsets the effect of drought. So then we kind of come to this higher dotted line. So essentially the effect of thinning could offset the effects of drought, which would result in a lower net carbon loss, and maybe for less time, and then a higher recovery potential, which this is what it's really all about, in my opinion. Whether it's harvest or drought or fire or the combination of all of them, carbon is going to be lost in the short term at some point. And so we really have to challenge ourselves to think long term and how we can allow these on a tree level to resume carbon uptake, which will then scale up to the forest level. And the more chance we give trees to do this and allow them to bounce back and recover, or when there has been a wildfire, or whether we thin before a fire so that the effects aren't as drastic, the more that we do this and work with forests and with fire, the better our recovery potential will be. So over here on Moscow Mountain, as I said, we're currently processing the data from a mixed species site. And so we've currently kind of looked at this exclusively in ponderosa pine, which is really important as this species accounts for the majority of conifer forests in some of these regions. But there's several other species that are also really important. Some of those are Doug fir, western red cedar, grand fir. And so we have all this set up in those species. And what I'm working on right now actually is processing all that data. And so that's water use, the carbon uptake, soil respiration, that whole carbon balance idea. And I want to process all that. And then we'll have an idea of how thinning will not only affect trees in general, but may impact species differently. So species have different behaviors when they close, in terms of how they close their pores during drought or how they uptake carbon, and they may respond differently to these treatments. So we're really going to tease that out and understand, and how not only a forest may respond, but how a mixed forest could respond. So hopefully I'll have more data on that in the next year or two. And if you're ever in Moscow Mountain, please come look at these sites because they're really exciting. Just to end on a really fun note, I do want to point out that fieldwork can be challenging. This is some footage, some night cam footage that Tara had set up early on in the project. They couldn't figure out what was destroying all of their sap flux sensors, and it turns out that bears like shiny things. So little cubs playing with our stuff there. But it turns out it was Mama Bear who was really eating through the foil and trying to take down our sap flux trees. And then, of course, we have lots of elk and moose. Wouldn't be Idaho without them, right? Who love to eat our soil respiration collars. I think this guy realized it wasn't food and may have put it back. But so fieldwork's not without its challenges, and it's been really fun to try to measure these trees and figure all that out and learn about all the wildlife that come through and are also interested. So I just want to summarize what I've gone through in this presentation really quickly. Fire, drought, and harvest can all affect the carbon balance, whether the forest is or the ecosystem is a carbon sink or a carbon source. The trees are incredibly resilient and recover from a lot. We have seen trees that are scorched all the way to the top of the canopy, and we're like, there's no way this tree is alive. There's no way it's coming back. And then we climb up there, or we look at the drone footage, or we look at the data, and it's fine. Still moving water, collecting carbon, so they can recover more than we think. We just have to give them the chance to bounce back after these really disturbances and events. What is done after a wildfire is just as important as what we do before a fire and to prepare for it. So just because we have something that's a catastrophe, it's not over. It's, let's not panic. Let's not cut everything down. Let's wait and let's respond in a way that will benefit the ecosystem and the long term and benefit our atmosphere and our net carbon balance. And harvesting can impact that carbon balance a lot. And thinning increases carbon uptake, it decreases drought stress and reduces risk from potential wildfire. So in the short term, we're learning a lot, but the long term is what's most important. And we really think that over time, thinning and active management, actively working with the forest can reduce these risks that we're having and reduce the severity of wildfire overall. Hopefully you've learned something about the way carbon moves through forests. And if you have any other questions, I would love to address those. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Kelsey. That was, I really enjoyed your graphics, and I thought that was very fascinating. It's exciting to see you working on the combination of harvest and drought and fire. We do have some questions in the chat, and those of you who've not put one in yet, please do so. And Ava and I will just ask questions of you from the chat. So Judy asked, do all species of conifer respond the same way or mostly ponderosa pine?
Okay, so that is a great question. No, all species of conifers do not respond the same way. So I'm always going around saying not all trees are equal because they're not. And Doug firs are a really good example. They actually respond really differently and kind of the opposite of ponderosa pine. So ponderosa pine is something we call isohydric, but what that means is that at the first sign of drought stress or anything, it kind of closes off. It's a play it safe species. So it closes off its stomata, going to preserve what it has at the risk of taking up any more. Doug fir, on the other hand, is a let's play it risky tree. So they'll leave their stomata open to a very risky point. We've seen very stressed out trees, but they're still taking up carbon. So it's a balance. And that's really what we're trying to figure out is can we characterize, does this species respond this way and this species respond that way? And then can we project that?
Okay. Thank you. Nan, would you please unmute and ask your question of Kelsey? I'm not sure I understand it entirely.
Well, she sort of answered the question right as I asked it about it takes time to make up. If you're removing carbon from a forest, it takes time for these trees, even though they might be responding, to make up for that carbon of a large tree. And I want to add that there's thinning and there's thinning. I mean, the model is presented in a simplistic kind of way because that's the amount of data you've been collecting so far, and I understand that. And I think it's great what you're doing. As a fellow physiologist, I think it's wonderful that we still need physiologists. But would be interesting to know if a comparable in mass, biomass of a Doug fir with a ponderosa pine, which is really taking up more carbon. And also the kind of thinning. I don't know what your thinning model is there, but you're probably, how you select the trees that you thin out is very, very critical. I'm dealing with Field Spring State Park, and it's breaking my heart up there, honestly, at the kind of thinning they're doing up there that's supposed to make it more fire resilient. And what they're taking out are these wonderful, healthy Douglas firs because they're leaving the ponderosa pine, and they're doing, and in the meantime, there's a lot of the ladder fuels that are underneath, the scraggly, thinny, bad stuff. And so it's a complicated problem because you want to contract somebody to do thinning, and they may be thinning, it's all about selection. And so it's going to be important. What you're doing is critical because we need to develop appropriate algorithms for thinning that will maximize carbon down the road. And that's why what you're doing is so essential and it's wonderful, but it's much more complicated than, I understand that. And so I congratulate you on what you're doing and wish you all the best despite the bears and the critters.
Thank you very much. And I completely agree that it's way more complicated. Tara actually did release a paper, I think a few years ago, maybe 2017 or maybe a little earlier. And she looked at the effects in carbon of different types of thinning. So there was like sparing and sharing, if you're familiar with those terms, but it was the idea of basically how intensive are we selecting. And then I think it's really interesting which species we're selecting because there's this idea of, just go in and get Doug fir and leave ponderosa pine. But I personally think Doug fir is awesome, and really the way it behaves is really interesting to me. So yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting moving forward to see kind of which species respond and if we can use data to better inform which trees are being harvested.
And then you also have the topography variations. So you have draws, for example, where there's a lot of grand fir. And we also need to understand better what fire behavior is like in different forms of fire. With these extreme fires we're having, there's a lot of ideas sometimes that thinning actually can cause fire to increase because it's providing the fire with more oxygen. There's a lot of variation that goes on with that. And grand fir is another interesting tree that it can actually, if it's really healthy and it's really dense, can actually almost smother a fire when it's trying to go through. And then the other issue is when you get too thinned and you're leaving only ponderosa pine, then you have a lot of understory vegetation that springs back in there and creates another kind of fuel. So it does get complicated,
It is. One day we'll have a succinct flow chart for people, maybe.
Oh, it'll be an amazing model.
Yes.
Multivariate kind of model. But congratulate you. Great talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? You could unmute yourself and ask directly if you like.
Hello, Susan's here. I do have a question on the salvage logging and the loss of the carbon sink. If in the picture with the salvage logging, if trees were planted in there and the veg and the shrubbery started to come back, will that help restore the carbon sink, or is there something in the salvage logging that prevents it from returning to a carbon sink with
yeah, so there's a number of ways you can answer this, and I'll say this is my opinion because I think different people have different opinions on this. So when you replant anything, you're not replanting a forest. You can't replant a forest. A forest regenerates over decades and hundreds of years, and it's lots of below ground interactions that we can't possibly replicate. And all of that contributes to this carbon balance. That being said, trees taking up carbon are better than no trees taking up carbon. So if that is the decision that's made, I think replanting in some capacity, at least there's plants there, there's greenery, there's something that's taking up carbon. But at that point, I would call that a plantation. It's not something, it would still take years and years to get to the point that a forest would. I guess in my opinion, nature can always do it better. So we think we're going to be able to clear it out and replant it to the capacity that it could recover on its own. I personally don't think that's completely possible. I think it's better if we let it go and on its own. But again, a lot of other people may disagree with me on that. And so a tree is better than no tree, but a replanted tree is not the same as a forest tree, even one that has been heavily damaged and may die, even if it's less there to die on its own. In my opinion, that's better than removing it completely from the system.
Thank you.
Kelsey, there's a question from Steve. As you indicated, a forest composed of has more than trees. In general, what % of a Pacific Northwest mixed conifer forest stored carbon is incorporated into living tree biomass versus the rest of the system above and below ground?
Oh gosh. Okay. So just the trees versus all the other underground species and everything else.
Including the shrubs and
Understory, yeah. I don't know an exact number for you, but the thing with conifer stories or conifer forest is a lot of its light availability, and the trees can access so much more of it than the understory. So it's also going to change seasonally. So if you ask that question in the spring when there's more light availability and there's a ton of greenery on the bottom, there's going to be a higher lower proportion in the trees relative to everything else. But when you come in later summer and in the fall and stuff, most of it's going to be in the trees. But I don't want to give you an exact number on this, but I would still say the majority is in trees.
Okay. Steve, does that answer your question? You want to ask a follow-up? Several people have said what an excellent talk and excellent research. It was really fascinating. I thought the figures were informative. But I have a question about the kinds of fires. It seems like, well, two things. It seems like from your drone pictures, there's a lot of tree left. Mm-hmm. Even when all of the trees are dead, mm-hmm. There's a lot of biomass that's there. Is that generally accepted? Because it seems like people have the assumption that the fire destroyed everything.
Yeah, that's a great question. So something we're particularly seeing in the face of climate change is an increase in what we call mixed severity fires. So this fire looks this way specifically because there were these really crazy winds going on that were blowing the fire in this really weird pattern. So you get like a strip of decimation and consumption there, and then nothing over here. But that's happening more and more because winds are changing, precipitation's changing, and heat waves are really increasing the way that fires are changing. And so as that continues, I think we're going to see more of this like heterogeneity in the way that fires are burning landscapes. But that's a really important question too. So there's not always also a one answer fits all, even in just your private land area. You may have a range of forests, and maybe the answer is to cut some of it and to leave some of it, and understanding when and how to make those decisions is going to be really critical to preserving the good biomass, the stuff that's going to recover and come back.
Okay. And perhaps prescribed burning or more frequent, having more fires under less extreme conditions as well.
Yes, lower intensity fires. Yeah. So yeah, the lower the fuels, if there's not a lot there to burn, no matter how bad the winds are, we're not going to get those severe fires. But you do see sometimes where the whole landscapes burn the same way, but we're seeing more of these mixed severity fires with the changes in climate.
Okay. Thank you. And the projections are for a lot more area to burn in the future in the Northern Rockies.
Unfortunately so.
Well, maybe it will actually thin forests in places where we couldn't otherwise thin.
Maybe, yeah.
Any other questions? Why don't we stop here then? Thank you so very much. Kelsey, would you give us your email?